the level of like ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. All right, everybody. Hi, can you hear us? Is that? Yeah. Okay, great. Let's learn. Okay. Hi, Kim. Good morning. Trying to make it. There should be some text over there. All right, everybody. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishon mitzvos v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. V'ha'erev na ya Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fi amecha beit Yisrael v'ne'anachnu v'tzetzeinu v'tzetzei tzetzeinu kulanu. Yodei shmecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah ya ha'melamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Blessed is the source of life. We're given this Torah to learn this morning and Zoom to navigate and you know, setups and technology and all kinds of good things. Okay, wonderful. Let's learn. I'm going to share my screen, which is not that one, but I guess this one that I'm sharing. And can we all see it? Share the source sheet with you. There you go. Okay. The oldest known biblical text is source number 1 in this week's Torah portion. And now you can actually see why it's impossible to do this. Like this kilo zanolech. Like the 3 of you are here in the room, and the 42 of you over there, and the kilo madin. We haven't even figured it out yet. Spent 2 hours on this week, and we still haven't figured it out. All right. So we have the oldest text in the Torah, the oldest known text in the biblical tradition. You can see it, source number 1. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. Yah spoke to Moses, saying, Daber el Aaron v'elbanav lemor, speak unto Aaron and to his children, lemor, saying, Ko tivarechu et b'nei Yisrael. Thus, like, it's a strange locution, Ko tivarechu, like, Ko. What is Ko tivarechu? Thus shall you, right? This is the way to do it. This is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. And more lahem, say to them. Say to them, okay. What say to them? Say to them this, or, you know, Moses says to Aaron to say, like, so Moses is to tell Aaron to say this to the children of Israel. Yivarechecha Adonai, may Yah bless you, and then also Yishmerecha, protect you, or guard you, watch over you. Ya'er Yah panav elecha bichuneka. May God's face shine to you and also grace you. May you be graced. May you be chained. The word bichuneka. Yisad Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God lift up God's face to you, and then v'yasem lecha shalom, and then place or give to you. The word is, it's a funny thing. It should maybe, to give to you would be v'yitem lecha shalom, but here it's v'yasem, lasiv, to place on you, for you, to you, shalom, peace. The beautiful structure, of course, is held in place here because if you look in the second source, this is kind of the way that Everett Fox, I mean, both, I wanted to see it in 2 different versions, both kind of side by side and one above the other. And essentially, you look here in source number 3, I'll make it a little bit larger for all of you. This is the oldest known biblical text that has been found. Amulets with these verses were written on them, have been found in graves dating back in the First Temple period and are now in the Israel Museum in Yerushalayim. A lot of interpretations about the threefold blessing, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, each one of them representing, or is it God's mercy, God's chesed, Gevura, and also Tiferet. A lot of different ways to understand the tripartite division. But if you want the story behind it, in 1979, 2 little silver scrolls inscribed with portions of the well-known apotropaic priestly blessing of the Book of Numbers, apparently once used as amulets, were discovered by a 13-year-old boy by accident. They were found in one of the burial chambers. The delicate process of unrolling the scrolls helped to develop a method that would prevent them from disintegrating. It took 3 long years, and they finally opened it, and their discovery was that they found, this it's the earliest known citation of text found from the Tanakh, and it's also the earliest source of confessional statements. There were some confessional statements in there, but the earliest, right, if you look here, source number 5 from Everett Fox, this is you'll see that the first question about these blessings, aside from their structure, it's 3 words and then 5 words and then 7 words. It has a very magical quality to it. It's very incantational. The most interesting, I guess, the first question that we might ask ourselves is, what's it doing here? What's it doing at this point in the Book of Numbers? So Everett Fox writes, the priestly blessing with which the chapter ends, chapter 6, ends with this priestly blessing, is striking and sufficiently beloved by Jews who have survived to this day in the synagogue liturgy. But why is it here? Meaning, why is it here in the Book of Numbers, and why is it here specifically at this point in our Parsha, which begins with a lot of things having to do with the temple, and then they move their way towards, those who have bodily emissions and have to leave the camp, and then it moves into Sota, the story of the adulterous wife, and it ends. It comes right at the end of that, right? It comes right at the end of that part of the Torah. We deal with Nazir as well. So what's it doing here? So he says, perhaps the blessing of the people is yet another example of a priestly function that has not been preserved in Leviticus, since it relates neither to sacrifice nor to purification, although it should be pointed out that Moshe and Aaron give an unquoted blessing. We'll see that in a moment, Leviticus 9:23, right? The blessing itself makes wonderful use of ancient Hebrew rhythm. Before we get there, let's just stop. So perhaps the blessing of the people is yet another example of a priestly function that's not been preserved in Leviticus. So it's now coming, in other words, it comes here as part of a series of things that were not in Leviticus, which of course the book of Vayikra is dealing all with the things that have to do with the priests and the Levites. And so it kind of makes its way into the book of Numbers, right? We've been talking about Levites in the census and so on. So we kind of imagine that this is some Levitical, we forgot this box and now we're going to put it here in Numbers in the Parshat Naso, which has a number of other things that were a part of the priestly caste or part of the priestly duties and ritual in the temple, and that now, as it were, has been forgotten, as it were, now it appears here. Now, it's a bit of a stretch, frankly. We're going to get to a couple of other possible reasons for its appearance here in the Parsha that relate more locally to what really just took place right above. But for the moment, let's just finish with Everett Fox's beautiful, overview. The blessing makes wonderful use of ancient Hebrew rhythm, a threefold structure of progressively longer lines that is reminiscent of a magical formula. What I said, the varied verbs give comfort, reassurance, as does, of course, the last word of the blessing, shalom, which we'll get to in a moment. The benevolent lifting of God's face is a known image in the Near East. Its devastating opposite, which is the hiding of God's face, is found in Psalms, in the source number 4 that you can see above, where the psalmist in Psalm 67 says, Elohim yechanenu, may God grace us, vivarchenu, and also bless us. Ya'ir panav itanu sela, and illuminate God's face to us right on. Sela is kind of like Reb Zalman says, right on, right? May it be so. So you see the vestige of this image from the Bible, of course, in the Psalms. It kind of maintains its space there as well. The section, the top. Okay, fine. What I just said. Now, it appears like this is maybe the most common magical formula found in all of ancient Israel. And of course, we know very well that it's maintained its power even throughout the last couple of millennia. It's not as though it went away when the priests were no longer doing it. So we'll get back to that in a moment. But let's for a moment just finish up the question of what's it doing here? We said, Everett Fox has his own theory that it's because of it belongs in the book of Leviticus, but now it's here because there are some things that were left out of the Levitical to-do list. I know we put it here. Okay. Ibn Ezra, the great medieval exegete, has a different approach. And so does the Ralbag, the source number 6 and source number 7. So if we look at source number 6, Ibn Ezra al-Bamidbar, he writes, V'nismecha parshat birchat kohanim, and the parsha known as the blessing of the Kohanim is connected to what came before, which is the Nazarite, right? Immediately before this is the Nazarite. Ka'asher hishlim Torat HaNazir, shehu kadosh, hiskir Torat Kohanim, shehem kedoshim. So Ibn Ezra says, listen, we're talking about holy people. The Nazarite is a holy person, as it's, the Bible tells us, the Torah tells us in the previous parsha, in the previous psukim rather, called the parsha, that he was called Kadosh. He's a holy person. So because we're talking about holy people, now we bring in the Kohen. I don't know about how many of you, if we get like a poll on whether or not that is Occam's razor worthy, is that the most elegant explanation of why the blessing of the Kohanim is here? Doubtful. But that's Ibn Ezra. But he said, listen, the Nazarite is holy. And so now the laws of the Kohanim are also holy. Let's raise a number of really quick questions about why that might not be an elegant explanation. There are so many priestly elements and priestly laws that were in the book of Leviticus. Why is this particularly here? Why here? Because the Nazarite is holy? Okay. Really? So this is the next one. I think is the most for me integrative and most spiritually resonant. And although it's not translated in the Hebrew into English, I'll translate it. Everybody can see where I am. Source number 7. This is the Gersonides or Ralbag. Can you see that? What I've highlighted? I'll go word by word. V'achar shezachar. After the Torah has now told us what a person can do to bring, or one can bring or do, to remove the inner war that a human being experiences within their own soul. Right? So the Nazir, right, according to the rabbis, the Nazarite is someone who abstains from various things in order to work with a dilemma that has appeared in their own soul, that they feel as though, right, they're at war with themselves and they've abstained. And we talked about that at length last night in the shul, right? They've abstained from wine, they've abstained from various things. The Torah comes along now, he says, and the war and the conflict and the infighting and the loss, right, that emerges from that inner struggle affects our homes, our nation, and in general, the general body politic and culture. It reminds us, this parsha, this particular piece of Torah, about the blessing that comes from leaders, from Kohanim. That this raises up and brings to mind the power, a wondrous power, al inyan hashlemut ve'ashalom amiti, that brings us to a reminder of the ultimate goal of, I would say, of Torah and everything we do, is to bring about a resolution of conflict, a resolution of those wars that appear both on the soul and in the body politic. That this is kind of like a perfect capping to chapter 6 and to all of the things that came before in this parsha. Also, this is, I think, for me personally, the most resonant of the reasons why it's here. It's also not very elegant ultimately either, because there are other parts of the Torah where there's tremendous conflict and the Birchat Kohanim doesn't appear there. But we might never know why it appears here exactly. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in a moment. Let's move into why are the Kohanim the ones who give the blessings, right? Why are the Kohanim, the priests, the ones who give blessings? So the Kohanim, it's according to Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of pre-mandate Palestine. Rav Kook was himself a Kohen. Rav Kook was a priest, and he took that very, very seriously. And for him, if you look at the book of Malachi, the very end of the prophets, the prophetic readings, the last of the prophets, in chapter 2, Malachi writes, Ki siftei Kohen yishmeru dat, for the lips of the Kohen, of the priest, are the ones who shomrim dat, who watch over, or who are the keepers of knowledge. V'torah yivakshu mipihu, and let people seek Torah, or the law, from their mouths. Ki malach Adonai tzvaotu, because they are the messengers of Yah, the God of diversity. So Rav Kook writes about this: the function of the Kohanim in source 8 is not only to serve in the temple. The Kohanim are also expected to teach and elevate the people. And he quotes this verse from Malachi. And these two roles are interrelated, since the source for their spiritual influence on the people originates in the holiness of their service in the temple. There is one duty of the Kohanim that combines both of these roles, the priestly blessing. The blessing is part of the temple service and at the same time reflects their interaction with the people. The Kohanim recite the blessing with outstretched arms, a sign that their efforts to uplift the people are an extension and a continuation of their holy service in the temple. Now, in some way, Rav Kook here is maybe answering the first question in the most remarkable way without actually saying it for those of us who are reading Rav Kook. So Rav Kook is telling us that the role of the priest was to work in the temple, and because of their work in the sacred center, their vibration or their connection to God, their connection to love, their connection to Torah is so profound that they then become teachers of Torah and those who are doing outreach, as it were, right? It comes from the work in the temple is how they charge themselves, and then the Torah yivakshu mipihu, and that people come to learn law from them or to learn Torah from them, is an extension of Kook writes of their being, right, charged by the temple precinct, whatever it might be. And so for Rav Kook, the blessing, the Birchat Kohanim, is actually everything, right? Both of those roles, both to be charged and to do outreach in one moment, right? They're, as it were, they are imbued with a certain level of love for the people as the blessing for the Kohanim. Whenever the Kohanim bless, they say that the Kohen is supposed to bless the people, be ahava, with love. So here Rav Kook says that those two pieces come together beautifully in the liturgy, or in the Birchat Kohanim, I should say, and it's to serve to uplift the people. Now, maybe that's the reason why this particular blessing and this part of the Kohanic or the Kohanite, the priestly role, comes in this parsha, because the name of the parsha is, of course, Naso, lift up the people. And the first thing that, the last thing that you do, that there's so much in this blessing that has to do with lifting up the people and stretching out your arms. As Rav Kook says, the lifting of the arms, right, is an expression of, it's a symbolic expression of the point of the blessing. The point of the blessing is not just to confer blessing, but in some way to reach the people and lift them up, because great leaders, Rav Kook wants to argue, and priests are, quote unquote, the paradigm or the archetype of great leaders. They don't just bless the people, but their blessing itself lifts them up and is nosek. It's like they lift them on their own arms. The Mishnah Avot, Pirkei Avot, says that Hillel used to say, Havu mitamidav, in source 10, shall Aaron be a student of Aaron's. Ohev shalom, v'rodev shalom. Where did Hillel get this? Of course, Rav Kook is playing off of Hillel. Hillel says, you want to be, right, from the students of Aaron? Love peace, pursue peace. Right? That's a deep, clear connection to the priestly blessing. Love humanity, love your fellow creatures, and then bring them close to Torah. That's Rav Kook's rendering, right? And then Hillel is also taking it from Malachi in that source number 10. So what is this lifting of the hands? And then we're going to eventually come in for landing in about 10 minutes, everybody. So Breshit, the first instance of blessing, channeling through the hands is, of course, not, right? The lifting of the hands that Rav Kook said is such a symbolically important part of the Birchat Kohanim, right? As you reach out your hands, you're also lifting up people. And frankly, everybody, I think a lot of us here know that the name given to the actual priestly blessing, right, is called Nisiat Kapayim, the lifting of the palms. So, okay, palms, We'll get, the Kabbalistic meaning of that we'll get to in a moment. But something about lifting the hands is not altogether new in the Torah. Its earliest place is in Jacob's blessing of his grandchildren, Menashe and Ephraim. So we look at source number 11 in chapter 48, right? Vayishlach Yisrael et yamino, and Yisrael, Jacob, he sets forth his right hand. Vayashes al rosh Ephraim, and puts it onto the hand of Ephraim, even though he's the younger one. We're not going to go into that now. But smolo al rosh Menashe, and then put his left hand on the head of Menashe, left hand on Menashe. Sikel et yadav, he twists his hands, or he guides them with seichel, with intelligence. Ki Menashe b'chor, because after all, Menashe was the b'chor, and he should have put his right hand on Menashe, but he kind of did it this way. So this text, right, is a text which, of course, comes down to this day that when we give blessings to our children, or children are blessed, or human beings are blessed by others, we put our hands on them. We put our hands on their kepi, right? Yaakov Emden, the great Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote that from here we have a clear indication that one is to bless their children with two hands. Both hands have to be involved in blessing, even though the Vilna Gaon says only one hand, the right hand. But to this day, we put hands on people. So this stretching out of the arm, of course, continues not just in blessing of children, but in, right? I'm not going to do that source, stretching out of the arm from Abraham, which is even earlier, but that's not really related to blessing. It's that he had to get his hand, according to many sources. The reason why he reached his hand out to find the knife is because his hand wasn't going to do that. His hand was only for blessing, but it had to tell his hand to do something against its nature. I'm not going to go into that. But Moshe in source number 14 is lifting up his hands. Remember that? He's lifting up his hands like Ayak Asher Yarim Moshe Yado, source 14. When Moshe's hands were up, right, it was good for the Jewish people, right? The hands were channeling blessing. And then, of course, in the actual lifting of the hands, in chapter 9 of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, when Aaron lifted his hands, Vayisa Aaron et Yadav, or Yado, it's written Yadav, Ela'am, and Aaron lifted up his hands. This is at the end of the 8-day or the 7-day consecration of the tabernacle. If people remember this, on the 8th day, Aaron and Moses come in, and then they both come out, right? And they bless the people, right? That's Aaron's blessing. And here, according to Rashi, the blessing that he gave him, the people rather, was the priestly blessing, even though it wasn't yet given until the book of Numbers. But we see here the central role of hands. It appears even before we even know that there's a blessing, that Aaron has to lift up his hands to the people. And as we saw earlier in Rav Kook's rendering, the reason for that is in order to channel blessing, and not only channel blessing, but to lift up the people symbolically with his hands. Now, Kabbalistically speaking, the hands are the 10 sefirot, the 10 energies of divine potency, and the hands are held up. And I don't know about you all, but I grew up in a world where we didn't look at the hands of the priest when they were actually duchening, which is the Yiddish word for blessing. In my temple growing up, we covered ourselves with a talit so as not to see the magic that was happening, right? That was coming out of the chi that was coming from the hands, the prakti and the shakti pot that was coming out of the hands of the Reiki, right? I know that Nehemiah is doing Reiki training tomorrow, so that was the goal, was to not potentially injure your eyes by being overwhelmed by the magic happening through the hands, right? The hands of the priest, which is a decidedly different take on it than, let's say, Rav Kook's notion that the hands being outstretched are actually to lift the people up. It's more like to confer blessing on them, to give them some kind of blessing and some kind of power. But that's kind of like this fundamental role of the hands and the arms in lifting people up and doing this naso, this lifting that priests are intended to do through this magic. Now, lastly, and then I'm going to open this up, the remarkable question, I guess, at play in the priestly blessing, which is kind of, the elephant in the room. It's the problem in the room, as it were, from the beginning of the text and on, which is if we look back if we look back at the sources, all the way to the beginning of the sources, everybody, the beginning of, I'm sorry, if we look at source number 2, can everybody see source 2? Yeah. The very last verse, which is not a part of, again, it's not a part of the beautiful 3 words, 5 words, 7 word structure. It's after that capping moment. It's really the capping verse of the Parshat Birchat Kohanim, the blessing of the priest. Verse 27 says, "V'samu et shemi al b'nei Yisrael." Now you place my name on the children of Israel, or they shall place my name on the children of Israel. And then God says, "V'ani avarchem," and I will bless them. So, as they would say in Yiddish, abazoi, if that's the case, right? If that's the meaning, right, of this, the entire philosophical and ideological question is, as they say in the Talmud, hadar kusha leduchta, like the difficulty in this text comes back to bite us in our tuchas, which means, what is the function of the priests to bless the people? Are they like are they intermediaries? Why can't God give a direct blessing to the people? Why do we need the priest to do it? What's the role? I mean, if God says in the end of this, and it's not just a question that's kind of a philosophical question, it's also a question inherent in the text where God says, now place my name on them and I will bless them. Is it to say, right, well, what were they doing? What is the role of this beautiful, incantational, magical, and it might, by the way, also be more broadly construed as a question of like religion itself. Like, what's the point of all of these rituals and structures if in the end of the day, we have a direct line of connection with the divine? What's the point of all the words? What's the point of all the rituals? What's the point of, belonging? Like, what's any of it all about? And so this question, of course, is, I'm not going to be able to show it to you in the English, but I want to just read it to you from Yitzchak Arama, an early philosopher who wrote a really important work on Torah and on philosophy itself called Akidat Yitzchak. He writes, "Ma to'elet b'mitzvah hazot." What is the benefit of this mitzvah? Ritzoni kishe'amru habrachot ha'ela mipi hakohanim el ha'am. Like, what I mean by this is when the priests, they give these blessings to the people. Ki hu yit'aleh hu hamivarach. Because God herself is the blesser. Uma yosif uma yitin. What can we add and what can we give? Ki yivarchu hakohanim o yachtulu, whether the Kohanim bless or they don't bless. V'chi hayalem l'sayo. Does God need the priestly help? Does God need them to help her bless the people? Why not just bless the people? And so a commentary on the Akedah, Reb Chaim Yosef Pollack, quoted in the Chamalei, where it says something very beautiful. First, he says, let me show you the answer given by the Baal Akedah. Yitzchak Arama's answer is in source number 18. And it's a crazy story from the Talmud, Masechet Shabbat, on page 89. It's a crazy, crazy story. So everybody see source number 18? The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi? Okay. The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. B'sha'a she'ala Moshe l'marom mitza'o l'kadosh baruch hu shayam kosher ktarim le'osios. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says there was a moment, there was an hour at the time when Moses went up to heaven, Lamarom, and found the Holy One of Blessing tying crowns on top of the letters. Amar lo, Moshe, ein shalom be'ircha. God says to Moshe, you don't say hello? Like you show up. Like apparently there's something missing from the story. It's an amazing story. There's something missing in the text because apparently Moshe starts to talk to God. And God says, wait a second, no hello. Where you come from, like, it's a funny phrase, right? In your city, right? We might say like, some of us might say like, in your house when you grew up, you don't bring your dishes to the table. It's like, what is that? How you were reared? Like, is that what's your practice? What's your custom, right? So God says to Moshe, in your world, people don't say hello to each other when they walk in the door. Amar lo klum yesh evet shenosim shalom l'rabo. And he says, is there a certain, Moshe responds to God. I love this. Like, I love the way the rabbis imagine God and Moshe having these conversations. It's so very personal, intimate. So Moshe says back to God, is it possible for a servant to greet the master? It would be disrespectful. In other words, I came in, I was quiet, and you're powerful. I'm not powerful, right? You have more power than me. I was nervous. I didn't say anything. Is it possible for a servant to say something, right? It's not my role to say something. Amar lo, haya lecha le'azreini. You should have helped me, God says. You should have helped me. God gives tochecha. God gives rebuke to Moshe and says to him, is that a way to imagine? Do you imagine me so perfect, so beyond reproach that, right, you should have helped me. And miyad amar lo, and immediately Moshe says to him, V'ata yigdal na koch Adonai kasher dibarta. And Moshe prays this verse and says to him, right, may the power of God be great as you have spoken. So this is a remarkable Talmudic story, and it is the story that is used by Yitzchak Arama, the one who asked the question, what's the point of the priestly blessing? He uses this story to explain why we need the priestly blessing. And so this commentator, Chaim Yosef Pollack in source 18, wants to unpack how this story is relevant to the question that Yitzchak Arama asked. And so he says, Shesha'alu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said Moses asked the Holy One a blessing. Right? God asked Moshe, Ha'ishtadalta gam ata k'fi yicholata amanhiga enoshi l'shacher shalom ha'chevra asher ata b'tocha b'kiyuma b'shlemuta musarit ayidei hanaga ruya ve'eshara musarit. God says to him, did you make every effort according to your capacities as a leader and as a human being in order to bring about shalom ha'chevra, the completion and the fulfillment of your culture, your social milieu that you exist within? Did you make every effort according to your ethics and your capacities, according to the musarit, which is ethical alignment? He says, Moses thought in this story that we can't do that. It's impossible. He said, because Moshe assumed that human nature was such that it would always be full of factionalism and always be full of pirud, separation and loss. And Moshe also thought, as much as I can do, right, and much as I can in my individual way work, how much work can I do? And anyway, I'll die and it still won't have moved the needle at all. Al pitiva miyad Adonai Hashem yitbarach shehu yotzer manig v'ken kol hatev. He said, because you, God, you're in charge of everything. It's beyond my capacity. V'al ken yeshiv. And that's why Moshe said, klum yesh eved nosein shalom l'rabo. That's why he says, Moshe said, is there a servant who can give peace to the one who owns peace? What's my peace to you who own all peace? Al ken hara Adonai yitbarach. And therefore God said to him, no. God says it's true that everything is dependent upon me. There is a force that is more powerful than all human individual agency and will. Even so, it's still upon you to purify yourself and make yourself holy. It's still up to you, right, to do the work that you have to do as much as you can do in your milieu. And only through there can everybody be, right, brought to another level of ethical and moral possibility. The evolution is dependent upon us. Right, with the help of God, God will also help what we have to do. Just like he says, says, like the analogy is, as long as there's land that hasn't been tilled and soil that hasn't been made and prepared for seeds, it doesn't matter how much rain comes. It says the rain will come. God says the rain will come, but you have to prepare yourself and the people to receive it. And you have to do that work to prepare the soil of your heart and the soil of your culture, the soil of the society itself for those blessings to land. You have to plant those seeds. He says, and that's the meaning of what God says, you should have helped me. You should have helped me do, right? It might be human nature ultimately that we want the good, but if we don't work for it, it won't happen. Now, this is the meaning, right, of quote of the Rav Yaakov Mecklenburg, a 19th century German rabbi, wrote, that's the meaning of the word V'samu et shmi al bnei Israel. What does it mean? The last verse of the beautiful Birchat Kohanim is God saying, Samu, place my name on them, right? And then I will bless them. He says to imagine the word to place here, don't think of it, he says, as, right, to put like a jar, Sam al Shikhma, when Rebecca put the jar on her shoulder, the jugs of water. No, think of it as V'samtem et dvrei ela alavachem, when you place the words of God in the Shema on your heart, right? Place my name on them means let it sit there and let it soften them. And then v'ani avrachem, if you do the work, Kohanim, priests, others who are preparing the people, lifting them up, then blessing can come down. And that's the work of the priestly blessing and of all human initiative, is that it's a partnership with the divine in the mind of, right, in the mind of the Baal HaKidah, the mind of Yaakov Mecklenburg. And I'm going to stop here for comments. And
I've got something.
And then we'll come back, hopefully, maybe for one little piece on the actual blessing itself. So let's see. First, we'll take in the room, Paul, go ahead, and make sure you can hear. Can you guys all hear Paul?
Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi, and for bringing out the essential quality of the handedness, and our hands, our arms, our left, our right. You know, in Judaism, it's a matter of really life or death. And what really amazes me is that we know, but much more recently than our ancient knowledge, in chemistry, that we have chiral molecules that are handed. And if you get it wrong, as was discovered in the 1950s by the pharmaceutical industry, when they were making a drug and they made a mistake about the chirality of a molecule, and boom, we had thalidomide. So we had horrific transmogrification of the human body based on that mistake of the handedness.
So that mistake led to some really horrible things. Okay. So the opposite of blessing. Yeah. Well,
we have to be aware of it.
Amazing.
For me, one of the powers of this blessing is the imagery of God's face, which not so long ago was so terrifying to the Israelites. And God would not allow Moses to gaze upon his face. But now the face has been transformed into benevolence and the power to bestow benevolence. And so perhaps an answer to the question of why here, this is now what the priest's responsibility is to transform the face of God into something that is actually directly transformative.
I love it. So Paul, did everybody hear Paul? Could you all hear him? Make it up. It's like the role of the priest, and we might say, I mean, we say this frequently in Jewish renewal or in neo-Hasidic circles, based on actual sources, not like we didn't make it up. In the Zohar, it says that in every generation, there's a little bit of motion inside each and every one of us, and we are, I think, many of us familiar with the archetype way of looking at personae in the Bible itself or in the Tanakh. The Kohen function, you might say, the function of the priest and the function in us is to, and what this blessing does literally, and then also in future generations, is allow us to imagine that the face of God, far from being a terrifying, or the face of authority, or the face of the mentor, the face of the one who has some power, that either we've given or that actually exists, to be a benevolent face, a face that is, right, that is vichuneka, to imagine God's face gracing us. That word chen is so beautiful. And then the lifting of God's face to us, and that God's face might bring us peace. And just acknowledging that that's not always been the case, right? And as many of you know, that I've often talked about post-traumatic God disorder, and that part of what Reb Zalman used to say frequently, and that I found very, very healing for me personally, was that in Kabbalah, the notion of a divine face becomes a really powerful and essential tenet, which is that there are many faces. The partsuf, the term is partsuf. It's a Greek word, which means a perspective or a face. And so, the healing of our experience of a face that would grace us, that would, right, the face of grace, or the grace face, and the illuminate face, and that is vital. The vital piece of this. And I love that you brought that. And I think that that's also, to some extent, maybe when we bless our children, or we bless other human beings with this, we can readily imagine, when we're saying it, we really want that face of God to be a powerful source for them, right? And so in that moment when we invoke this, we get to play the role of the priest and say, if I were a priest and I was conferring this and saying these words, what do I mean? What face, right? And sometimes I think, I would say that if you're going to give someone this blessing, you might first invite them with a small intention that says something like, I'm about to bless you, and the face of God will be mentioned. I invite you to imagine a face that is loving and that receives you so that you can receive this, right? And that intentional kavanah, because I do that when I internally, is a very profound way to not go into the automatic pilot that immediately or unconsciously brings an image that isn't uplifting and doesn't do what Rav Kook said, which is to lift the people and to bring them to a place of bracha, to blessing. I'm going to go. Thank you for that, Paul. 2 Pauls in the room, and Jay, and then Jill, and then one last text, and we'll leave the room open for shmooze. And go ahead, Jay.
Wow. I realize now I may have a different question about the elephant in the room, or a different way of asking it. For me, the question is not so much about role and function, but about source. If we go back to Rav Kook, the source is clear. When we had a temple, the source was almost magical, in the Holy of Holies or whatever, the priest had the source of the priest's authority, if you will, was almost magical. And I'm wondering if the first verse from Yaakov gives us a hint of where the rabbis, and I'm asking you if they developed this, might have seen the new source once the temple was destroyed, because it's Sikel et Yadav. And I think you even translated it having a connection to Sechel. So I'm wondering, therefore, if the source has gone from magical to something about Sechel, about wisdom, from magic to wisdom. And if that's the case, is that true? And then how is that, how is that seen as being acquired?
So I think almost all of our sources, traditional sources do have a fundamental belief in, we might call it magic, we might, in the human capacity to channel blessings beyond the the natural human ability, right? So I think that to ask the sources whether or not the sources themselves believe that human beings have magical capacities is, I think it's a given. That I think that, with the Rambam, it's a little bit more complicated. Maimonides, who was a rationalist in that way, but from the Kabbalah on, there's no doubt whatsoever that human beings have a magical component. There's no doubt. The question, of course, is for all of us who might not believe in magic, or might find these verses or this institution a bit foreign. And, I don't know, people, I once saw this story in the shul that my colleague and friend and remarkable Rabbi Angela Buchtal, who grew up in the Reform world, once came on the holidays to Romemu, and she brought her daughter, and they were sitting in the pews, and on the holidays, Romemu does duchening, we do priestly blessing, and she'd never seen it in her life. And her daughter turned to her and said, like, what are they doing? And so she wound up talking about it at her Friday night sermon, talking about the priestly blessing. And so I think that the answer to you is, is it wisdom? Is it not wisdom? I think that the answer that I can offer, Jay, is that, I think it's wholly dependent on you and your perspective. I don't know if you or many of us believe that Kohanim, just by virtue of being born Kohanim or Kohanot, or have a unique possibility by virtue of their birth. But I certainly imagine people in my own life who if they were to give me a blessing, would immediately feel blessed by that, right? And so, there is, of course, the more expansive notion of somebody conferring blessing or giving blessing, whether it's attention, whether it's, people spend their whole lives trying to get people who have something and want something from them to give them, right? To give them a good word or a kind word. What were you going to say, Jay? Your hand was up.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, you now raise Korach's question, right? I mean, who made you the Holy One? But then that is a question really as a community. How, as a community, not a one-on-one, but as a community, how is that legitimacy conferred? You go to JTS, is that it? I mean, so I'm not trying to be a smart aleck here. I'm just really wondering about taking seriously that question of the source when we no longer have that magic room in the temple.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that, if you want to read this story as a story, if you want to see the essential problem, let's just name the two problems that are up and make a clear distinction between them. The first problem is God the blesser or are the priests, which is a general question of humanity's agency vis-a-vis the divine. And if you understand the divine in a particular way, what is the role of any of the flimsy reeds that human construction might, put forth, and why would God need that? And the answer given, at least to that question, was humanity has a role. We're partners with God, and we prepare the soil for God's reign, as it were. And that is a role that God has given us, as it were. And in both in the temple, in religion itself, in our ethical, cultural, social, human evolution. So that was one bucket. And then the second question, which kind of dovetailed, which emerged, which is, what legitimacy or authority is legitimacy and authority given to a particular group of people, and how does that legitimacy and authority inhere? Is it something inherent? Is it something, that is conferred from the community? Where do people get that from? I don't think you were asking if it exists, because I think as a phenomenon, it certainly exists, whether it's charisma, as Max Weber wrote, right? Certain people have certain charisma and certain gifts, and people are, recognize those gifts. And those gifts seem to be natural and not necessarily always earned. But in some degree, like America's Got Talent. Some people get up and they know how to, they have something, they got something. And some people work at it. And some, and how does society delegate leadership in those ways? Is it conferred because you're a Bush, you get to become the next president? Or is it something you have, those things are really awesome, amazing, big questions. And I think that there isn't one answer. I think each community can decide, there are some communities who absolutely are anti-charisma, anti-personality, anti-gifts. They say, no, that's a dangerous road. We're not going to do that. It's about the communal mind, and the community confers, and there's a shadow to that. And there are shadows to the other side. I think that all of those, the Korach story has all kinds of questions that both, that defy simple answer. I think that's, for me, that's the way I would respond. Okay, Jill, and then I had wanted to show one last thing, but we might not get to it. Go ahead, Jill.
Okay, great. This was a beautiful teaching. I'm going to do something different, which is I'm just going to try to summarize it to make sure that I understand it. So basically, the teaching is that Moses, from this crazy Midrash story, Moses enters in to the ethers where God is, and is just decorating the top of the Torah letters, and he just kind of stays in his lane and doesn't greet God, and God says, what, you're not going to even greet me? You're not going to, what do you do in your world? Don't you, bring the dishes to the table? Don't you greet people? And so that's kind of the explanation as to the rules on our plane, is that there is going to be someone like the Kohen who's going to, do things in our limited capacity, but do things to share blessings. And they give us an example of how to do that. And then I guess the last thing that I'm just kind of ascertaining from that is that by seeing that example, even though I guess I hear you, because I go to a Sephardic minyan, we're not supposed to look when that's happening, but you can feel it. Then during the time where people bless their children, they kind of emulate what the Kohen have done. So in a way, it's kind of there's kind of a democratization of that hierarchy. So that's kind of my comment and a question as to whether I have the teaching summarized in a way.
I think you nailed it. I think you got each piece, each and every piece. And especially the last piece about how wonderful it is that over the course of 2,000 years, what was the primary locus of holy in the temple became moved to the family and to the home. Wherever your home is and whatever your home is, there's a chance for your home to become a little temple, and you're the priest in it or the priestess, and you can confer blessings. And that was, as you said, I think beautifully, the democratization of blessing. I just wanted to look at one last beautiful text that was brought to my attention by my colleague and teacher friend, Michal Biton, in the actual blessing of the priestly blessing itself, in the actual blessing. So if you look at source number 21, we have the Mishnah Avot that says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, in ein kemach, ein Torah, in ein Torah, ein kemach. One of the most famous phrases in all of rabbinic literature. If you have no bread, there ain't no Torah. And if there ain't no Torah, you ain't no bread. Right? So the Bible says that we don't live by bread alone, but by the word of God. But without bread, there won't be any word of God. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, this great rabbi, writes beautifully and compellingly about the role that the physical and the spiritual play with one another, that they are, this is almost like a koan, a kind of Buddhist riddle, right? Which one? It's kind of a Mobius strip of infinity, right? Which one, the physical or the spiritual? Which one comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, they're all exactly right. So on this idea, the great commentator Seforno writes on the Yivarechecha Adonai v'Yishmerecha, that when we say Yivarechecha, it says, may God bless you. It's not spiritual. It's with money. Because without money, right, you don't get to do like spirit stuff. Because im ein kemach ein Torah v'Yishmerecha, and make sure that you're guarded from people who want to steal your money. Right? Right, and then he goes on to say, identity theft. Right, and then he goes on to say that the next phrase, right, and the next phrase, then we're talking about spiritual things in the 5-word second phrase. The second phrase is, may you be illuminated, your face be illuminated with wonders of Torah. And then he says, and then in the third phrase, 7 words, may God's face appear to you and lift you and give you peace, which is the ultimate yearning of all humanity, minuchat shalom, like a resting place of eternal peace. And in this, my friend Michal Biton wanted to argue that the priestly blessing mirrors Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we begin with the basics, physiological and safety, right? And then we move to something more refined. Like if those things are available, we're not scared all the time, and we have like the lower chakras of our existence, right? Yivarechecha, may you be blessed and protected. Then love and belonging, right? Then grace, sexual intimacy, family, friendship, self-esteem, right? That's in the second paragraph. And then the final 7-word blessing, shalom, self-actualization, morality, creativity, spontaneity, and problem solving. And I want to bless all of us. As I leave this room, and I know that you'll stay in it, I think, for a little while, may each and every one of us be blessed with all of these dimensions, and that in our roles as receivers, we receive it, and as our roles as active blessers, we confer it and lift one another up. Amen. Brachim to you, brachim to you, brachim to you. We will see some of you, we hope, in a few moments in the
Sure.
sanctuary in the shul for this morning's celebration of Rabbi Rivera and also for the bat mitzvah of Molly Stillman. Good Shabbos, Yashikov, Zoe, and thank you all very much.